2:47 a.m. on November 22, 1983, a radio transmission cut through the silence of the Kagi forest in Nova Scotia. The frequency was 1,440 kilohertz. No one should have been transmitting on that band. No one should have been transmitting from that location. Martin Doyle was alone in his cabin when he heard it. He had been a ham radio operator for 15 years, knew every commercial station, every active military frequency in the North Atlantic. That voice shouldn't exist. It was female, calm, repeating coordinates that didn't correspond to any known point on Canadian nautical charts. After the coordinates, always the same phrase, "Don't turn it off." Martin recorded everything on a 90-minute Maxell cassette tape. That recording exists to this day, sealed in the Provincial Archives of Halifax under code YRM 83A. Very few people have had access to it. Those who listened reported recurring nightmares, the sensation of being watched, and in 2 documented cases, unexplained disappearances. But the 1983 transmission wasn't the first, nor will it be the last. The first reports date back to 1958, when loggers working near Rossignol Lake began reporting voices coming from within the woods. They weren't animal cries. They were words, coordinates, names. In 1962, a fisherman named Harold Keeping called the local CBC Halifax radio claiming he had heard his own name being called by a voice coming from his portable radio. "It was my mother," he told the reporter. "But my mother died in 1951. The Yarmouth Vanguard newspaper published a note on March 14, 1974. Ghost transmissions continue to puzzle residents of the Kagi region. Authorities investigate possible interference from pirate station or undisclosed military experiment. No official investigation was ever completed. No equipment was found until 1983, because in 1983, 3 people decided to track down the source of the signal. Martin Doyle, retired telecommunications engineer; Elaine Fraser, investigative journalist for the Halifax Chronicle-Herald; and Thomas Wicks, former Canadian Navy radio operator. They set up camp 8 kilometers from the southern shore of Rossignol Lake, in an area known locally as the Dead Zone, where compasses spun endlessly and electronic devices failed without reason. What they found changed everything. On the 3rd day of searching, guided by an improvised signal locator, they reached a narrow clearing surrounded by black spruce trees. In the center, half buried under layers of moss and rotting branches, was a wooden cabin measuring less than 3 square meters. The door was locked from the inside. The windows, covered with irregularly nailed boards. When they forced entry, they found the radio. It was a Soviet military model R-250M, manufactured between 1961 and 1968. It was on. The tubes glowed faint orange, emitting heat. Beside it, a completely corroded truck battery, covered with white crystals of sulfate. Technically, that battery shouldn't have enough charge to keep even a flashlight on for more than a few minutes. But the radio kept transmitting, and the voice kept repeating, "Don't turn it off." Martin reached out to turn the dial. Elaine stopped him. "Record it first," she said. Thomas was already running the tape. What they recorded that night would become the most disturbing audio document ever catalogued by Canadian police. 47 minutes of continuous transmission, overlapping voices, some in English, others in French. One of them, according to Thomas, in Russian. And at minute 32 of the recording, a young male voice saying, "Tommy, please, get me out of here." Thomas Wicks recognized the voice immediately. It was his brother, David Wicks, who disappeared on August 11, 1971 during a fishing expedition on Rossignol Lake. His body was never found. At 11:17 p.m. that night, Thomas left the tent, said he was going to the cabin to check the equipment. Martin and Elaine heard his footsteps moving away down the trail. Then silence. Thomas Wicks was never seen again. The next morning, when Martin and Elaine returned to the cabin, the radio was off, but the tubes were still warm. And in the dust on the floor, there were recent footprints, all leaving the cabin, none entering. The KG Wilderness region in southern Nova Scotia is one of the most isolated territories in Atlantic Canada. More than 400 square kilometers of boreal forest, glacial lakes, and peat bogs. During World War II, the Canadian government installed 3 radio relay towers there for communication with naval convoys crossing the North Atlantic. The towers were deactivated in 1947. Officially, all were dismantled. But records from the Department of National Defense, obtained through the Access to Information Act in 2003, show something different. There is mention of an experimental communication structure kept in operation until at least 1952, under joint supervision of Canadian military and American technicians. The project was classified as Operation Cold Mirror. There are no further details. All subsequent pages were removed or censored. The first civilian reports about anomalous transmissions began in 1958. On June 4th of that year, a group of loggers from the McLeod Timber Company reported to the foreman that they were hearing radio voices coming from the trees. The foreman, Donald Fraser, noted the incident in the company logbook. Team 7 claims to hear transmission in English and French coming from unknown direction. No radio equipment present at location. Work suspended for 2 hours. The phenomenon repeated. In 1959, 7 occurrences. In 1960, 12. Always in the same region, a radius of approximately 15 kilometers around Rossignol Lake. Always on the same frequency band, between 1430 and 1450 kilohertz, a band reserved for long-range maritime navigation. On September 22, 1962, Harold Keeping, a lobster fisherman residing in Yarmouth, was returning from a night expedition when his Sony TR-63 portable radio began picking up a transmission he described as impossible. Keeping recorded a statement for CBC Halifax radio 3 days later. The recording still exists in the station's archives. I was tuned to the news station, 1410, when suddenly interference started. I thought it was a storm, but the sky was clear. Then the voice started. It was a woman. She spoke slowly, like reading coordinates, latitude, longitude. Then she said my name, said Harold, clear as a bell. Then she said other things I won't repeat, because it was my mother's voice. And my mother died in 1951. Keeping refused to provide further details. 6 months later, he sold his boat and moved to the interior of Saskatchewan. He never returned to Nova Scotia. The reports continued throughout the 1960s, but were treated as local curiosities, fishermen's legends, until 1974, when the situation changed. During the spring of that year, for students from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Claire Doherty, Michael Grant, Susan Pelly, and Raymond Boudreau decided to spend a weekend camping on the shores of Rossignol Lake. On the night of April 12th, all 4 heard the same transmission. Susan Pelly described the event in a letter sent to the Yarmouth Vanguard, published on March 14, 1974. It was almost 11 at night. We were sitting around the campfire when we heard a voice coming from the radio Raymond had brought. It wasn't static. It was a clear voice, female, speaking in English with what seemed like a European accent. She repeated numbers. Then she said something none of us forgot. If you're hearing this, it's already too late to go back. Michael turned off the radio, but the voice continued. It was coming from inside the forest. The 4 students left the campsite immediately. When they reached the main road, it was 3 in the morning. Raymond Boudreau wasn't with them. According to RCMP Police Report Number 74, RS 091 from Yarmouth, Boudreau was found 7 hours later, walking barefoot along Highway 103, 23 kilometers from where the group had camped. He remembered nothing after hearing the voice on the radio. A medical examination at Yarmouth Regional Hospital detected no drug or alcohol use, but the attending physician, Dr. Ian Mackenzie, noted in the medical record, "Patient presents dissociative state. Continuously repeats, 'She knew my name. How did she know my name?'" Raymond Boudreau never returned to university. According to public records, he currently lives in an assisted living facility in Truro, Nova Scotia, and does not grant interviews. The Yarmouth Vanguard published Susan Pelly's letter with a cautious editorial. Ghost transmissions continue to puzzle residents of the KG region. Authorities investigate possible interference from pirate station or undisclosed military experiment. The RCMP conducted a superficial search of the area. No equipment was found. The case was filed as unidentified atmospheric phenomenon. But between 1974 and 1983, at least 17 people reported similar experiences. 3 of them disappeared. 2 were found days later in severe confusion, with no memory of events. 1 was never found. And then, in November 1983, Martin Doyle decided it was time to discover the truth. Martin was a retired engineer from Bell Canada, specialist in long-range communication systems. He had worked on the installation of microwave networks in Northern Ontario during the 1960s and intimately knew the technical limitations of radio equipment in remote environments. When he read about the Rossignol reports, his first reaction was skepticism. Ghost transmissions were almost always explainable by ionospheric interference, signal reflection, or simply poorly adjusted equipment. But the more he investigated, the less conventional explanations made sense. He contacted Elaine Fraser, investigative journalist for the Halifax Chronicle-Herald, who had covered the Boudreau case in 1974. Elaine was skeptical but interested. Together, they reviewed all available reports and identified a pattern. All transmissions were picked up on the band between 1440 and 1445 kilohertz, always at night, always at locations within a 15-kilometer radius of Rossignol Lake. Martin built a directional signal locator using parts from old radios and a portable oscilloscope. Elaine obtained authorization from the MacLeod Timber Forestry Company to access the trails in the region. And then Martin remembered Thomas Wicks. Thomas had served as a radio operator on the HMCS Haida, a Canadian Navy frigate, during the 1960s. He knew military radio better than any civilian. But there was another reason Martin called him. Thomas had a personal reason for wanting answers. His brother, David Wicks, had disappeared at Rossignol Lake in 1971. When Martin told Thomas about the transmissions, the response was immediate. "When do we leave?" On November 19, 1983, the 3 entered the KG forest with camping equipment, tape recorders, signal locators, and detailed topographic maps of the region. On the 3rd day, they found the cabin, and inside, the radio that should never have been on kept transmitting. The cabin measured 2 meters 80 by 2 meters 40. Built with roughly hewn spruce boards, covered by a corroded zinc roof. There was no foundation. The structure was supported directly on rocks and rotting logs. According to Martin, this wasn't a recent construction. From the state of the wood and metal, I'd say it had been there for at least 30 years. The door was barred by an internal bolt. They had to force it with an improvised lever. When the door gave way, what they saw inside left them silent. In the center of the cabin, on a crude wooden table, was the radio. A Soviet military model R-250M, used by Red Army field units between 1961 and 1968. It was a robust unit, designed to operate in extreme conditions. The chassis was enameled steel in olive green, with 3 analog displays on the front and a central tuning dial. It weighed approximately 20 kilograms. The radio was on. The tubes glowed faint orange. The needle on the central display oscillated between 1440 and 1442 kilohertz. And from the built-in speaker came a voice. It was female, spoke in English with an accent Martin described as European, perhaps Slavic. The voice repeated coordinates: 47 degrees, 12 minutes, 33 seconds north, 65 degrees, 8 minutes, 19 seconds west. Then a pause of exactly 5 seconds. Then the phrase, "Don't turn it off." The cycle repeated every 23 seconds. Beside the radio, connected by thick copper cables, was a truck battery. A 12-volt Delco, completely corroded. The terminals were covered with a white and greenish crust. Lead sulfate, sign of deep discharge and prolonged abandonment. Technically, that battery shouldn't have enough charge to keep even a flashlight on for more than a few minutes. But the radio kept working. Elaine was the first to speak. "How is this still on?" Martin knelt beside the battery and carefully touched the terminals. "I don't know. This should be completely dead." He took a multimeter from his backpack and tested the voltage. The device read 11.8 volts, within normal range for a charged truck battery. "This doesn't make sense," Martin said. "Look at the state of it. It's been corroded for years, but the charge is stable." Thomas was standing in the doorway, staring fixedly at the radio. "There's more," he said, pointing to the left corner of the cabin. There was an antenna, an improvised structure made of intertwined copper wires, connected to the radio by military coaxial cable. The antenna went up through a hole in the roof and extended into the tree canopy. Whoever set this up knew what they were doing. "This isn't civilian equipment," Thomas said, "and it's not amateur. It's a military field installation." Martin began photographing everything. Elaine turned on her tape recorder and began recording the transmission. Thomas approached the radio and examined the front panel. There were inscriptions in Cyrillic on the chassis. "R250M, he read aloud. "Soviet military radio, used in long-range field operations." "What is a Soviet radio doing in the middle of the Canadian forest?" Elaine asked. "I don't know," Thomas replied, "but someone brought it here, and someone kept it operational." Martin pointed to a pile of objects in the right corner of the cabin. There were rusted food cans, empty cigarette packs, a dark green canvas military backpack, and 3 notebooks with black oilcloth covers. Elaine picked up one of the notebooks. The pages were yellowed and stained with moisture, but the writing was still legible. It was cramped handwriting, in English, dated March 1952. She read aloud. "March 12, 1952. The transmission continues. Night after night. Always the same voice. Always the same coordinates. I tried to triangulate the origin, but the signal seems to come from everywhere at once. Webb says it's ionospheric interference. I don't believe that anymore. March 15th, Webb disappeared this morning. Went out to check the antenna and didn't come back. Found his boots 300 meters from the cabin. He was barefoot. March 17th, I'm alone now. The voice called my name. I won't turn off the radio anymore." The last entry was from March 19th, 1952. Just one line. "She knows where I am." There were no more pages, and there was no signature. Elaine put the notebook back on the pile. "We need to take this to the police." Thomas shook his head. "And say what? That we found a haunted cabin with a Soviet radio that works without power? They'll commit us." Martin was kneeling again, examining the battery. "There's something strange here." He pointed to the base of the battery. There were additional wires coming from the terminals, disappearing through the wooden floor. This is connected to something else. Thomas knelt beside him and followed the wires with his eyes. They disappeared through a crack between the floorboards. There's something buried underneath. They lifted 3 boards from the floor. Underneath, there was a metal box buried in the earth. A military ammunition box, painted in matte green, with the lid sealed with industrial electrical tape. Martin picked up the box and placed it on the table. Elaine cut the tape with a knife. Inside, there were more notebooks, topographic maps marked with red circles, black and white photographs, and a 7-inch reel-to-reel tape in a cardboard box marked Transmission, November 3rd, 1952, Do Not Play. And at the bottom of the box, a typed document on Canadian Department of National Defense letterhead, dated November 8th, 1952. Operation Cold Mirror, Final Report. All activities related to Project E-77 were terminated on November 7th, 1952. Equipment was deactivated. Personnel were reassigned. Structures were sealed. Access to the area is prohibited under ministerial authorization. Any attempt to reactivate transmissions will be considered a breach of national security. The document was signed by an officer whose name had been scribbled over with black pen. Thomas looked at Martin. What the hell was Project E-77? Martin didn't answer. He was looking at the radio. The voice continued repeating the coordinates. But now there was something different. The voice was saying a name. Thomas Wicks. Thomas froze. Elaine dropped the recorder. Martin turned the radio dial, trying to change the frequency. But the voice continued. Louder now. Clearer. Thomas Wicks. You can hear. You know you can. Turn it off, Elaine said. Martin turned the power knob. The radio went off. The tubes darkened. The sound ceased. Silence. And then, from outside the cabin, from the surrounding forest, the voice continued, coming from all directions at once. Don't turn it off. They stayed inside the cabin for almost an hour without speaking. Martin had the multimeter in his hand, pointing at the battery, but didn't move. Elaine held the tape recorder, still recording, though there was nothing more to record. Thomas sat on the floor, back against the wall, staring fixedly at the turned-off radio. Outside, the forest was in absolute silence. There was no wind. There were no birds. There was no sound of leaves, branches, insects. It was as if all life around the cabin had stopped breathing. It was Elaine who finally broke the silence. We get out of here. Now, Martin agreed. We'll take everything we can carry. The notebooks, the tape, the documents. We need to show this to someone. Thomas didn't move. He kept looking at the radio. Tommy, Martin said, we need to go. It was his voice, Thomas said quietly. I recognized it. It was David. Elaine knelt beside him. Thomas, we don't know what this is. Could be a recording. It could be. It wasn't a recording. Thomas looked at her. His eyes were red. I know my brother's voice, and he said my name. He called me. Martin put his hand on Thomas's shoulder. Then let's find out what happened to him. But not here. Not now. We come back with help. Thomas nodded slowly. They began gathering the equipment. Martin took the notebooks and documents. Elaine wrapped the reel-to-reel tape in a cloth. Thomas picked up the tape recorder where they had recorded the transmission. As they were about to leave, Martin looked back. Do we leave the radio on? Elaine shook her head. Leave it off. Don't touch anything else. They left the cabin and began walking back to the campsite 2 kilometers away. The trail was marked with yellow plastic ribbons they had left on the way in. It was almost 7 in the evening. Daylight was disappearing rapidly. They reached the campsite at 8:15 p.m. They set up tents in silence. No one was hungry, but Elaine made coffee. They sat around the campfire and reviewed the material they had brought. The notebooks were all handwritten, dated between March and November 1952. There were 3 different authors. One signed as Lieutenant J. Webb, another as Sergeant D. Morrison. The third didn't sign, but the handwriting was the same as the last notebook Elaine had read in the cabin. Martin read aloud. April 4th, 1952. Today we made the first attempt at response. Morrison adjusted the transmitter to the same frequency as the voice. When he turned on the microphone and spoke, the voice stopped. For 30 seconds, there was only static. Then the voice returned, but it didn't repeat the coordinates. It said, "Don't respond." Morrison turned everything off immediately. April 11th, Webb is convinced the transmission is a Soviet test. He believes there's a submarine transmitting from somewhere in the Atlantic, using the ionosphere to reflect the signal. But the coordinates the voice repeats don't correspond to any maritime position. They point inland into the forest. To here, April 28th, we found something. 50 meters from the cabin, buried at 1.5 meters depth. It appears to be part of an underground structure. Metal, corroded. We couldn't open it. Webb wants to continue excavating. Morrison refuses. May 3rd, Morrison disappeared during the night. Found his tent empty. His boots were outside, perfectly arranged, as if he had left barefoot on purpose. Webb is panicking, wants to abort the operation. May 7th, Webb also disappeared. I'm alone now. May 11th, the voice knows my name. The last entry in the notebook was from May 19th, 1952. I understand now. It's not a transmission. It's an invitation. Elaine closed the notebook. Whoever wrote this never left here. Martin picked up the Department of Defense document. It says here the operation was terminated in November, but these entries are from May. What happened between May and November? Thomas was looking at the reel-to-reel tape. There's a way to find out. Elaine frowned. You want to listen to the tape? We don't have a reel-to-reel player, Martin said. But I have a converter, Thomas said. In my backpack. I brought it because I knew we might find old recordings. He took out the converter, a small portable device that allowed playing reel-to-reel tapes through a common cassette recorder. He connected the tape, adjusted the speed, and pressed play. The tape began to roll. First, static. Then a male voice, tense, almost whispering. November 3rd, 1952. This is Lieutenant Richard Holloway. I'm recording this because I don't know if I'll get out of here alive. Webb and Morrison are dead. I saw the bodies. They were inside the structure, the one we found buried. We opened it yesterday. God forgive us, we opened it. Pause. Heavy breathing. Inside there was equipment. It wasn't Soviet. It wasn't American. It wasn't anything I've ever seen. And there were bodies. 3 of them, wearing uniforms I don't recognize. The insignias were wrong. The dates on the tags were impossible. 1987, 1993, 2001. Another pause. Sound of something moving in the background. The transmission doesn't come from outside. Comes from inside. From inside the structure. And it's not calling. It's responding. Responding to something that hasn't happened yet. The voice began to tremble. I saw my own name on one of the tags. My name, my birth date, and a death date. November 4th, 1952. Tomorrow. The recording ended in static. No one spoke. Then Thomas's cassette recorder, which was still recording the conversation around the campfire, began emitting sound on its own. The female voice, the same one from the cabin. Thomas Wicks. You can hear. You know you can. Thomas turned off the recorder, but the voice continued, coming from Elaine's portable radio, then from Martin's Walkman, then from all the electronic devices around the campsite all at once. "Don't turn it off." Thomas stood up. "I'm going there." "No," Elaine said, grabbing his arm. "Don't do it. I need to know what happened to my brother." "Tommy, you heard the tape. Whoever goes in there doesn't come back." "Then maybe that's why I need to go." Before Martin or Elaine could stop him, Thomas grabbed a flashlight and began walking toward the trail. "Tommy!" Martin shouted. Thomas didn't look back. He disappeared among the trees at 11:17 p.m. Martin and Elaine waited until dawn. Thomas didn't return. When daylight finally came, they followed the trail to the cabin. The door was open. The radio was on again. And in the dust on the floor, there were recent footprints. Dozens of them, all leaving the cabin in different directions. None entering. Nothing happened. He went home and never returned. Martin Doyle died in 2001 of heart failure. Elaine Fraser is still alive, living in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. She doesn't grant interviews about the events of 1983. When asked, she says only, "I know what happened, and I know no one will believe it." The story could have ended there. Another unsolved mystery, another unexplained disappearance. But in 2004, something changed. An acoustics researcher from Dalhousie University named Dr. Naomi Clarke was working on her doctoral thesis on acoustic anomalies in isolated North Atlantic environments. She was reviewing RCMP files when she found a reference to the 1983 case and to the tape. Naomi requested access to file YRM 83A. It took 8 months to obtain authorization. When she finally did, in March 2005, she digitized the tape and began analyzing it using spectral analysis software. What she found changed everything. The voice in the recording wasn't continuous. It was a compilation. Dozens of different voices, overlapping, all saying the same thing at the same time, but with millisecond intervals between them. The software identified at least 47 distinct voices, all female, all speaking in English, but with accents from different regions and different eras. And when Naomi isolated the underlying frequencies, she found something more, a digital data transmission. In 1983, this was impossible. Digital data transmission on AM radio would only become common in the 1990s. In 1983, especially on Soviet military equipment, there was no technology for this. Naomi decoded the data. It was a simple text file repeating coordinates. The same coordinates the voice said in the recording: 47 degrees 12 minutes 33 seconds north, 65 degrees 8 minutes 19 seconds west. She plotted the coordinates on a map. They pointed to Rossignol Lake, specifically to a submerged point 300 meters from the southern shore, where the depth was approximately 40 meters. Naomi contacted the RCMP, explained her findings, suggested that perhaps there was something submerged at that location. A vehicle, a structure, something that could explain the events of 1983. The RCMP sent a dive team in July 2005. At the bottom of the lake, exactly at the indicated coordinates, they found a military truck. It was a Chevrolet C60L, model used by the Canadian Army during World War II. The plate was corroded, but still legible: DND 4521. Department of National Defense records confirmed the vehicle had been reported as lost in transport in August 1945, 60 years submerged. Inside the truck, divers found 3 sealed metal boxes. Inside the boxes, radio equipment, tubes, transmitters, cables, technical manuals, and a document preserved in a waterproof plastic envelope dated August 12, 1945. Project E-77, Experimental Communication Equipment, transport authorized for installation in KEJI Wilderness. Classification: secret. The document was signed by an officer named Colonel Robert Holloway, the same surname as the voice on the 1952 tape, Lieutenant Richard Holloway. Naomi Clarke published her findings in an academic paper in 2006, Anomalies in Low-Frequency Radio Transmissions in Isolated Environments, the Rossignol case. The article was well received in the scientific community, but treated as technical curiosity. No one took seriously the part about the voices, except Naomi. She began investigating more deeply, discovered that Project E-77 had been a joint initiative between Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom during World War II. The objective was to develop long-range communication systems that didn't depend on undersea cables or satellites, which didn't exist yet. But the project was abruptly canceled in 1946. All documents were classified, and in 1952, a small team was sent to deactivate the installation in KG. That team never came back. In October 2006, Naomi decided to go to the forest. She brought professional recording equipment, latest generation signal locators, and a portable transmitter. Her intention was to map any radioactivity in the area and, if possible, triangulate the origin of any residual signal. She camped alone 3 kilometers from the shore of Rossignol Lake. On the first day, she detected nothing. On the second, she picked up a weak transmission on the 1,440 kilohertz band. Intermittent, almost imperceptible, but it was there. On the third day, the transmission got stronger. And on the night of the fourth day, at 11:17 p.m., her recorder picked up a voice. It was female, spoke in English, repeated coordinates, and then said, "Naomi Clarke." Naomi didn't panic. She was a scientist. She knew this could be a directed transmission, some kind of explainable acoustic phenomenon. She adjusted her equipment, confirmed she was recording, and followed the signal. It led her to the cabin. The same cabin Martin and Elaine had found in 1983. And inside, the radio was there again. Naomi sent an email to her advisor at the university at 10:45 p.m. on October 18, 2006. Found the source. Will document everything. Back in 2 days. She never came back. The RCMP found her campsite intact on October 22nd. Her equipment was organized. Her laptop was open, with the last diary entry dated October 18th at 10:43 p.m. The cabin is here, exactly where it should be. The radio is working. Going inside. Naomi Clarke was officially declared missing on October 30th, 2006. She was 34 years old. The case was filed as Disappearance in Wilderness Area, Accident, Animal Attack, Fall. The official theories were many, none satisfactory, but before disappearing, Naomi had configured her recorder to automatically transmit data to a remote university server every 2 hours. The last upload was at 11:15 p.m. on October 18th. It was an audio recording, 47 seconds. The female voice, clear, calm. Naomi Clarke, you understand now. It's not a transmission. It's a record of everything that will still happen. All the names, all the dates, all who will listen. You're on the list. You always were. Pause. Don't turn it off. Static. End of recording. The Dalhousie University server kept that recording archived for almost 3 years before anyone found it. It was discovered by chance in 2009 during a routine audit of unclassified files. An IT technician named Aaron LeBlanc was cleaning old folders when he saw the file Naomi_Clarke_field_rec_18_2006 vinyl wave. He didn't know Naomi, didn't know about the case, but he was curious. He opened the file and listened. After listening, he sent the file to the RCMP. 3 days later, he began hearing a voice coming from his cell phone, always at night, always the same female voice, repeating his name. Aaron LeBlanc never accessed that server again. He requested a transfer to another university and refused to talk about the incident. When contacted for this investigation, he hung up immediately and blocked the number. The RCMP analyzed the recording, concluded it was probable audio contamination or unidentified editing. The official report stated, "There is no evidence of criminal activity. The disappearance of Naomi Clarke remains under investigation, but there is no indication of third-party involvement." The case was filed again, but the story didn't end. In 2011, a group of urban explorers from the online forum Abandoned Canada decided to investigate the legend of the ghost station of Rossignol. They had read about the disappearances, about the cabin, about the radio, and they wanted to prove it was all invention. Four people entered the forest on August 14, 2011. Marcus Thibault, Jessica Rand, Kyle McIntyre, and Sarah Cormier. They brought cameras, recorders, GPS, and camping equipment for 3 days. They live-streamed on the internet throughout the first day, showed the trail, the campsite, the forest. Everything normal, everything calm. They made jokes about ghost radios and mysterious voices. On the second day, they found the cabin. The live stream showed everything. The locked door, the moment they forced it, the empty interior, no radio, no equipment. "Look at this," Marcus said to the camera, laughing. "The haunted cabin, absolutely empty." They camped beside the cabin, kept streaming, made a campfire, told stories, laughed. At 11:17 p.m., the transmission was interrupted. The last image captured by the camera showed the four sitting around the campfire. And then the screen went black. The audio continued for 17 more seconds. A female voice, clear as crystal. "You're on the list." Then silence. The transmission never came back. The four were reported missing on August 17th. A search team found the campsite on August 19th. The tents were up, the equipment intact, the cameras turned off. And inside the cabin, which had been empty 2 days before, was the radio. Transmitting. The RCMP confiscated the radio. It was taken for analysis in Halifax. Technicians tried to turn it off. When they turned the power knob, the tubes went dark. But the sound continued, came from the chassis, as if the metal itself was vibrating. They removed the tubes. The sound continued. Removed the speaker. The sound continued. They completely disassembled the radio, separated each piece. But the voice continued, coming from the scattered parts on the table. "Don't turn it off." The equipment was sealed in a Faraday cage, a cage designed to block all electromagnetic waves. The cage was locked, stored in an evidence depot. 2 days later, a security guard at the depot reported hearing a voice coming from the storage area. He opened the cage. Inside, the radio was assembled again, pieces perfectly fitted, tubes glowing. No one had entered the room. The radio was then transferred to a military facility at CFB Halifax, classified as material of interest to national security. Since then, there are no public records of its whereabouts, but there are reports. In 2013, an anonymous soldier posted on a military forum online, "I work in Halifax. There's a basement where no one goes. They say there's a radio there. They say it still transmits. They say if you hear your name, you never leave." The post was deleted in less than an hour. In 2017, a woman named Catherine Beliveau contacted the RCMP saying her daughter, Emily, had gone camping in KG and hadn't returned. When the search team found Emily's campsite, there was a note in her diary. Found the cabin. The radio is here. It's calling my name. I need to know why. Emily Beliveau was never found. In 2019, an anomalous phenomena researcher named Dr. James Pritchard obtained special authorization to access the provincial archives and review all documents related to Project E77. What he discovered was fragmented, censored, but enough to form a theory. Project E77 wasn't just a communication system. It was a temporal transmission experiment. The idea was to use ionospheric reflection at ultra-low frequencies to send messages not just through space, but through time. Messages that would be received before they were sent. The documents Pritchard managed to access mentioned self-reinforcing patterns, causal loops, and temporal resonance. The theory was that, once activated, the system would create a closed loop of transmissions that would exist outside the linearity of time. In simple terms, the radio wasn't transmitting from the past. It was transmitting from the future, from all futures, from all the people who would still hear it. And each time someone listened, the loop closed. The person became part of the transmission. Pritchard concluded his research with a simple phrase: "It's not a radio, it's a record of everyone who will disappear." And it always was. He delivered his report to the RCMP in March 2020. In April, he went camping in KG. He didn't return. Today, in 2025, the KG forest remains open to the public. There are warning signs on the main trails. Stay on marked routes. Do not camp in unauthorized areas. In case of emergency, call 911. There is no mention of radios, no mention of the cabin, no mention of the disappearances. But among local residents, among trail guides, among those who know the stories, there is an unofficial warning. If you hear a voice calling your name in the forest, don't answer, don't search, and never tune to 1440 kilohertz, because the station is still transmitting, and it keeps calling names. Names of people who will still camp, who will still search, who will still listen, and when they listen, they enter the list. The last official RCMP update on anomalous transmissions in the KG region was published in September 2024. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police is aware of reports of radio interference in the KG Wilderness region. Technical analyses indicate natural atmospheric phenomena. There is no risk to public safety. Citizens reporting unusual experiences are advised to avoid the area and seek medical assistance if necessary. But in November 2024, a transmission was picked up by a ham radio operator in Yarmouth. He recorded it and sent it to CBC Radio. The station refused to broadcast it, but the recording leaked online. It was the voice, the same as always, repeating coordinates. And then a list of names, 47 names, all of people still alive, all of people who, according to subsequent records, will camp in KG between 2025 and 2027. The last name on the list was not publicly disclosed, but according to rumors, it's the name of someone reading about this case now. Perhaps yours. File No. YRM 83A remains sealed. Radio location classified. Last detected transmission ongoing. Origin unknown. Frequency 1440 kilohertz. Message: don't turn it off. And now, a question for you. If you were alone in the forest at night and heard a voice on the radio calling your name, would you turn it off? Or would you need to know? If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more.